Hello, friends and neighbors, and welcome back to the poem of the day for today, Sunday, September the 14th, 2025. Happy Sunday to everyone. I hope that you have a restful and restorative and peaceful Sunday. If it is the case that you are off work today and on celebrating your weekend, it's kind of unseasonably hot here right now, which is a bit unfortunate because I like to spend these days outside, but it doesn't always line up that way that you get the nicest weather on your days off. And that's kind of the way it is, I suppose. Typically, we have a bit of a hot spike around the middle of November before the fall sets in more proper. And the poem today that we're going to read is a little bit about fall, but not about complaining about the weather so much as understanding the change and the death as a natural process in it. We did some poems about fall last week before we did the series of Shakespeare sonnets. And today, as I have a couple days kind of interim in between before starting a different series, I wanted to return back to this. You also might know that on Sundays I like to do poems that are a bit more devotional or explicitly spiritual or transcendent, not for the purpose of excluding anyone that might have non-religious beliefs, but just to take the day to be one that's reflective and joined in the spirit of prayer, not necessarily one that has to be tied to a specific prayer, but I think poetry in general requires an approach that is the spirit of prayer, even if someone is not a praying person, because it requires silence and attention and focus, a certain single-mindedness, a receptiveness to beauty, and I think those are secular values as well when applied in the right places. So today we'll be reading from Gerard Manley Hopkins again. And this poem comes from 1880. It's called Spring and Fall to a Young Child. As you know, if you listen to previous episodes with Hopkins, Hopkins is very interested typically in the grandeur of God, and writing this very enthusiastic and very almost hyperbolic verse in his. He was a romantic poet, but one that was more explicitly religious than the other romantic poets, much to their kind of dismissal of him in some places. And he had a kind of unique, upbeat um, meter or rhythm to his poems. This one is just one stanza, and it has within it at the beginning several rhetorical questions. It's directed, as you heard from the subtitle, to a young child. And what I think is interesting is the way in which he changes his style and diction throughout the poem to direct at the beginning to a young child and later to someone who's growing up. And hopefully you'll hear that through this reading. So this is Spring and Fall to a Young Child by Gerard Manley Hopkins, 1880. Margaret, are you grieving over Golden Grove unleaving? Leaves like the things of man, you with your fresh thoughts care for, can you? Ah, as the heart grows older, it will come to such sights colder, by and by, nor spare a sigh, though words of winewood leaf meal lie, and yet you will weep and know why. Now no matter, child, the name, sorrow's springs are the same, nor mouth had, no nor mind, express what heart heard of, ghost guessed. It is the blight of man was born for. It is Margaret you mourn for. Okay, one stanza here to this poem, 15 lines, so we might be tempted to go, oh, it's one stanza and it's kind of short. Is it a sonnet? It's not. And it, as I mentioned, has three rhetorical questions within the first four lines. You might have also recognized some irregular emphasis or some irregular meter. You might have recognized a rhyme scheme that at the beginning is simple and based on couplets, but then it breaks at a certain point. So we get grieving, unleaving, you, older, colder, then sigh, lie, why, name, same, expressed guessed, 4, 4. So that middle, psi, lie, y, around lines, I think that's 7, 8, and 9, indicate the turn, or we could call it the volta of the poem, and more on that in just a moment. So the beginning of this poem, the first 4 lines, the speaker is addressing Margaret, this young child who is grieving because of a whole kind of grove or a whole line of trees are losing their leaves, and the leaves are turning colors and falling off, and she's crying for this. And the speaker initially tries to tell her, this is like the things of man. This is some natural part of life. It's something that you're going to see a lot of. And he does liken her right at the beginning, which kind of foreshadows the conclusion of this poem, to something natural as well, calling her thoughts fresh. And we can think there of, something like produce, or something like grass growing in the rain, the things that are fresh that signal spring. And so this poem being called Spring and Fall does indicate with the imagery that those two things are contained within one another. That spring and fall, or growth and decay, life and death, youth and old age, are not things that are opposed as a binary. They're not things that are separate one from another, but they're things that have the other contained within them. That even in fall, looking at it through a young child's perspective with fresh thoughts, there are elements of spring. And even within spring, this is not in the poem, but we could extend this. Even within spring, there's the promise of death that comes later, which is something that he's kind of telling her at the beginning. Not necessarily, Margaret, you're going to die, but that these are the things of man. This is going to be common. And then we get this transitional word, this as the heart grows older. So this is where the speaker recognizes what it is that's upsetting her and is starting to try to educate her and give her a response. And he tells her that as you grow older, your heart will become colder, meaning obviously that you're going to be less impressed, less moved, less taken by. You become desensitized to these sorts of sights, and you won't spare a sigh, is what he tells her, right? You just kind of go along your business. But further along in your life, you will weep and know why. No matter now, child. So he's telling her again, you're not going to stop and cry at the leaves falling, but you will stop and cry at things. But then your grief will be tied to something. You'll know what it is that's upsetting you. Which I don't think is always necessarily the case. It's not really the case for people who are depressed or melancholic or overcome by sort of bouts of listlessness. But he is referring, I think, to something more like a concentrated loss, a loss of a person, a loss of a relationship. Those big parts of life that move us towards grief. But that he's not even going to tell her about them now because she wouldn't understand them. And sorrow's springs are the same, right, is what he tells her there. No, nor mouth had, no, nor mind expressed what heart heard of. This has to be an allusion, I think, to one of the letters of St. Paul. I wish I knew exactly off the top of my head, but the eye has not seen, ear has not heard what God has ready for those who loved him. And we know Hopkins being a Jesuit priest, that language is going to be in the back of his mind. But what's interesting is he says the mouth had nor heart expressed what the heart heard of. So no one has spoken, no one has thought of this language that the heart knows, which I think is an important aspect as a romantic writer, that he's trying to communicate to her that there is some part of romantic intuition that cannot be fully explained, taught, or communicated to you. But as a human being, you're going to be swept up in this. You are going to be overwhelmed by this at some point. And what is this thing? In the last 2 lines, he tells Margaret, it is the blight man was born for. And so that blight is it's our mortality, and it's our knowledge of mortality. That what's shocking her right now is that first realization when you're a young person, that first experience with death. For a lot of people, it might be a grandparent. For a lot of people, it's a pet. For Margaret here, it's looking at the trees. And what the speaker is saying here is you will get used to these things because that's just part of what it means to be a human, and part of human life is that you're going to experience it many, many times, countless times. But then this last line suggests, it is Margaret you mourn for. So he begins by asking Margaret, are you grieving? What are you crying? What are you crying about? And at the end, he's telling her that really when you're seeing the trees turn and the leaves falling, you are crying over your own mortality. That first experience of losing someone or losing something is actually just a recognition that you too will wither away at some time. I think there's another way to read this that's not entirely different, but the Margaret that you're mourning for is also just mourning, knowing that not necessarily that you are going to die and just being focused to yourself, but that knowing that you're going to experience this again and again in more profound and kind of horrible ways. That you might lose, that you'll lose your parents, you might lose a sibling, you might lose a loved one. And so you're mourning that you know that these things are coming in the future and that that's unavoidable and it's just a part of life, just like the seasons of fall. One of the things I thought about as I was reading this poem that goes beyond what Hopkins had intended was I was thinking a lot about just young people post Columbine and people who are sometimes referred to as, the active shooter generation, that they grew up just normally having to practice lockdowns in schools. And with the number of these mass shootings that we have in the country, specifically in the case that I'm thinking of, though not that it's any more or less important than any others, but with these young people going through and seeing all of these school shootings and that becoming such a normal part of their life, I see within them, and by no fault of their own, truthfully by the fault of the adults who haven't dealt with it, I see this as your heart grows older, it will come to such sights colder, by and by, nor spare a sigh. And it's not to say that they're uncaring, but it's to say that they, as a protective mechanism, I think have to be numbed because you cannot experience such a huge shock to your emotional system when that thing is happening every couple of weeks. And so I see a certain numbness in them that I sort of mourn for, and I think that they mourn for within themselves, that they have such an awareness of the precariousness and fragileness of life, not just theirs, but people like theirs, and that the feeling of having to resign to that when it feels as though things could be done to address it, I think gives them another numbness, a sort of cynical numbness, but a cynicism that's certainly earned. I'm not saying that as a dismissive way, but just to say that they are also losing a sort of sense of faith in other people because those people have not stood up for them. And so when I get to that last line, it is Margaret you mourn for. It just makes me think that in addition to losing so many people's lives, we're also losing this sense of wonder and this sense of innocence and fresh thoughts that Margaret has at the beginning of the poem. Just because we live in such a culture of death and such a culture where these images of death are around people constantly, and it's hard as an adult to deal with that, but imagining being a young person and being raised in that culture, I mourn for them and I mourn for the things that they're losing. Sorry to go really rather heavy on the Sunday morning poem, but I think Hopkins's piece is meditative in that way, and it's about man's fall in a different and kind of more removed or abstract way, and it makes us ask these very difficult questions when we're living through the times that we're living through. And I think the important thing within the poem, but also within our reading of the poem, is not to lose sight of the fact of the complex emotional and internal lives of people who are living through this time and through this climate, and the ways in which they might be hurting and might be trying to, buttress themselves away from that hurt. So it asks us to be, I think, like the speaker, and to give attention to not just the children, but especially the children around us who are weeping. And to not give them these cliched and trite responses of it's going to be okay, because the speaker never does that. He doesn't say there won't be another fall. He simply says that you'll come to get used to this, but that actually you are mourning something more deeper and more profound, which has to do with your very humanity. And so to mourn, as little kids do, over losses like that might seem as an adult to be kind of silly, but I think that there's a way of reading this poem that's kind of the purest form of an expression of grief, is to experience everything as though you're seeing it for the first time, because then you can see it fully in the moment that it is. And that's going to be my takeaway for today. I hope that no one has a mournful or a grieving day today. I hope you all have restful and restorative days, and that you're able to spend some time in the beauty of the fall. And I wish you all peace.